warm welcome to Ezra Klein and Wayne Hsiung.
All right. So one quick logistical matter before we start. We're actually going to encourage all of you in the audience and all of you on Facebook Live to ask questions and help us direct this conversation. But to make sure we give everyone a fair shake to ask their question, we're using a link, dxe.io/question.
Fucking
got
bullshit.
that? dxe.io/question. What's going to happen is Cassie up here on the front row is going to curate those questions. She sees a lot of people asking the same questions. She's going to wave me down. She's got a mic. She's going to say, you should talk a little more about that. Does that sound good, everyone? All right, great. Again, the URL is dxe.io/question. If you're on Facebook Live, you can ask questions as well. I am so honored and excited to have you here today because
I'm so loving all these compliments.
I mean, this is a guy
Great way
who,
to spend a Sunday.
You know, you did one of the best interviews of Hillary Clinton on your podcast. You've done amazing interviews of people like Elizabeth Warren. You wrote, in my opinion, the best thesis for why we need to impeach Donald Trump. Am I right? Just published yesterday. And here we are today talking about animal rights. And my first exposure to Ezra, for all of your sake, is I've been reading Ezra Klein since the early 2000s when you started blogging. You're really one of the first political bloggers and made blogging into a thing. But I didn't even realize you're an animal rights supporter and a vegan until Glenn Greenwald wrote a story about an FBI raid on a number of sanctuaries where they were trying to chase down some piglets we had rescued from a factory farm. It was a story that went viral, and you see a lot of the typical vegan influencers retweeting it, but Ezra Klein not only retweeted it, but made a statement in that retweet, something along the lines of, this is one of the greatest atrocities in human history. So it was stunning, but it was also a powerful moment for me to see that mainstream journalists were starting to talk about animal rights. And we're going to talk a lot about the policy issues and the bigger picture of how we can change American politics in the direction of animal rights. But my first question for you is about your personal journey. How did you get to the point where someone who is otherwise known for mostly writing about presidential politics, economic policy, is now spending quite a bit of your time thinking about animals and veganism? Sure.
Ooh, that's a good question. So first, thank you all for having me here. It's inspiring to be among so many people doing such great work. And I want to say that while I did go to UCLA and actually went to Santa Cruz for 2 years, it wasn't for lack of trying about going to Berkeley. They just rejected me twice. So it's not that I don't honor Cal. They just didn't feel it. So there are two questions here, I think. One is how I came to identify as somebody who cares about animal rights, as a vegan, and the other is its kind of eventual intersection with my work. And the weird thing, and I talk about this sometimes on the podcast, the weird thing about everything everybody in this room believes is that basically everybody else believes it too. That there was never any doubt in my mind that certainly the way we were treating animals and raising them for food, right? The way we were treating animals when we put them in confined animal feeding operations, the way factory farming worked was unjust. I hadn't spent a lot of time staring at it, but it operated across my consciousness as one of many things in life that are bad. And I do politics, and like my thing is there are a lot of things in life that are bad, and we should try to make them a bit better. And in my 20s, and maybe a little bit in my, sort of after I went to college and had more control over my food, and then in my 20s, I bounced back and forth from vegetarianism, and, you know, for a time I was eating a little bit of meat, but not much. And then just over time, it just became kind of less and less ignorable. And I can't quite explain what it was that created the transition, but the thing that I found was that the more successful I was at changing how I ate, the more I was able to let myself believe what I already believed. And that was an interesting and strange space for me. And then it was only after I was able to kind of successfully become vegetarian and then over time vegan that I was able to kind of face up to what it was that I already believed about animals and then the scale of what was happening. Because for me to do it before, it was easy enough to believe on the edge of my consciousness, but to really explore it would have said too much about what I was complicit in. And so that's my sense of it. And then in my work, I was thinking for after I'd come to embrace this a little bit more deeply, people here know this, but once you begin dealing with the scale of the suffering in this space, it becomes a little bit hard to worry as much as I used to about tax policy. It's not that tax policy is not important, it is. But where the top marginal tax rate is between 32 and 37 or 39 and 46 versus some of the other things that are being done, not just in my name, but that everybody I know, like we're all part of, or most everybody I know we're all part of, other things begin to take, the world becomes somewhat grotesque. And so once you have that experience of internal radicalization and you're sitting there with people who you love and people who you like and people you admire, and they're like leaving chicken on the plate, it becomes very, it becomes radicalizing and it becomes very alienating. And so then the thing for me was, well, I have this work and I have this platform. I obviously want to begin to converge these. I want to make the argument that if you care about suffering, which is certainly what animates my politics, what animates the politics of, I think a lot of the people who read me, you need to care about this too. But the question that I always struggle with is how do you do it without activating that set of defenses? How do you do it where the thing you are saying to people is not so damning and is not so big that they tune you out before you start? And I would say it was actually the podcast and launching a podcast that created more space for me, because you can be much more open and hesitant and gentle in that than writing sometimes allows. Writing is very black and white. It's very, very, very hard to hold space. Where a conversation, it can be a little bit easier. And so then it was kind of like step by step by step by step, figuring out me and then trying to figure out what role I felt I could play successfully in my work.
So what was it about your personal journey that you think allowed you to be open to that? I mean, was it that you just kind of accidentally fell into vegetarianism, veganism, and then suddenly the cognitive dissonance avoidance dissipated, so you were able to think about animal rights? And I guess the follow-up question to that is, do you think anything about your personal journey can tell us something systematically about how we can change the world?
So I never want to overly generalize myself. I feel a little bit weird talking about this because it isn't just my story. So I had been, as I said, kind of on and off vegetarian all through my 20s.
Because of animal suffering?
Because of animal suffering. Straightforwardly because of animal suffering. But my partner, Annie Lowry, I would say Annie is, like, I think of myself as a pretty moral person, and she's a more moral person and is more successful at, I would say, living her ideals. And so she went vegan first. And when you believe everything your vegan partner believes, and they're vegan, I was, I think, vegetarian at that point, it becomes hard not to make the jump too.
Anyone have that experience?
And so some of just my personal, some of my personal journey just has to do with, I think, being around people and in a context. And two people I would call out as really big influences on me on this are my wife, Annie, but also my colleague, Dylan Matthews, who is the lead writer of our Future Perfect section, which is an effective altruism section at Vox. And Dylan is somebody who, again, lives his morality and lives his ethical philosophy more clearly than anyone I've ever known, up to and including donating a kidney to a stranger. And so something that I've been really blessed in is around me, I have models of people who think very seriously and rigorously about how to live a considered ethical life, and then don't just leave it there, but actually act on it. And as I saw them and engaged with them, and then in many ways followed them, the thing that I am is a very good popularizer. So I live around very moral people, but I'm particularly good at sort of crassly popularizing their beliefs. And so like my role in it to some degree has been to try to think about, okay, having felt this and experienced it myself, I don't want to say that there's anything in my experience that is generalizable to the world, but I think
shit,
it's something
going really big with
sometimes
now
be
this
good at
audience. That's
is
awesome.
is bridging between sort of my experience of politics and the experience of kind of larger audience has of politics. Like I'm pretty good at understanding where is it that people already are,
because of the
what are the
Glenn
things
Greenwald
that
FBI thing.
are confusing or strange or creating friction in the conversation they're entering. That's the whole
like
of
Black Lives.
explanatory
He's the
journalism.
whole like.
And then how can I bring
He's
them
like
along
probably the biggest
on a journey sort
like
of
Black Lives
learning
Matter
or
guy.
change that I've had.
He's
And
half
I do
black.
that in a lot of different areas, but it's something that I've been trying to do in this one too.
I want to push you on that a little bit because I think there may be something we can systematize about that personal experience, and that is basically social networks theory, right? Which is, if you look at everything from happiness to even smoking, all these behaviors, social scientists are starting to ascertain and verify that a lot of these behaviors transmit through a social network like a virus. And even something that seems like a self-evident thing to do, until there's someone in our community who believes it, it doesn't seem possible. And so what's happening, I think, across the world today is more and more people are realizing they're vegans, they're vegetarians, they're animal rights supporters in their community, so they feel like there's some space for them to be a vegetarian or vegan as well. Do you think that's something that happened with you, that part of it was just seeing people you thought were credible, interesting, obviously people you cared about and respected, were coming out in support of animal rights, gave you that intellectual and moral and behavioral space to start moving that direction?
Yeah, so as I go into this, because I have a lot of strong feelings here, I want to say just one thing on my own terminology. I am by no means a perfect vegan. And so I very much identify as somebody striving there, and I never eat meat, I never eat eggs, but I'm not going to tell you I've never tasted cheese in the last year. It has happened. And so just one thing that I don't want to do is claim for myself. I want to be honest about where I am and also not claim for myself a label I don't get. But what I will say in this is that as I identify in this space and as I strive to make my life more compassionate and have gotten pretty far along there, I believe, to your point about social network theory, in being a strident vegan. And I'm a vegan, but I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. The way I try to act on the podcast, the way I try to act in my personal life, is not to be an asshole about it. But I think living a moral life is important. And I think that it is important, just as it was important for me that the people around me were not silent or hiding their ethical philosophy from me. I try to make it the case that people around me sort of know what I think on these things, so that there is a social pressure. So that there is also a social permission. One of the things that's very moving for me is I get a lot of emails from listeners who, I just got one actually yesterday, it's why it's in my mind, who say that I believed these things, but the people around me don't, and so I felt I couldn't talk about it. But hearing people like Julian Castro or Leah Garces or Bruce Friedrich or, the people I have on my show, and also one thing I try to do a lot on the show is have conversations about the kind of ethical horror show of what we're doing with people who are not identified as animal rights activists. Just have it in the conversation as something that is like one of many things that people should be concerned about, and that they feel that for them, it makes them feel less crazy and gives them a little bit more license, a little bit more of a permission structure to make these arguments in their own life. So I agree very much with the social network theory and feel very strongly that one of the great immune systems of the system as it exists right now is that it has exerted a tremendous amount of social pressure to tell the people who are trying to be less cruel not to make anybody else feel bad about it. It's like a constant, overwhelming social pressure. And I think it's actually really important, thoughtfully, right? Like humbly, but to push against that and to not actually be cowed by that, because it is fundamentally a form of cowing. There's nothing that I react to worse. Hearing about how people people don't eat meat, they might be right about that. People don't eat animals, they might be right about that. But they're just so frustrated, and they're always making me feel bad. And I always be like, you have no idea how much I am keeping my mouth shut. Like, you have no idea how it looks from the other side. And like what assholes meat eat, like all the license plates about bacon. The one that always kills me is just Chick-fil-A billboards, where it's like the joke is the cows don't want to be killed. It's like, ha ha ha, they're like spray painting eat chickens because the cows don't. It just like when you go through the looking glass on this, it's so crazy making that you really recognize just the power of some the power of what feels like light social sanction to hold in place very, very, very cruel social systems.
I'm going to explore that a little more with a concept that one of my mentors describes in a book called How Social Change Happens, which I encourage everyone to read. But it's a guy by the name of Cass Sunstein. And he wrote this book, and one of the fundamental concepts in this book is this idea of preference falsification. And what he points out is in many recent movements, whether you're talking about the gay rights movement or the Me Too movement, the reason these movements happened so quickly was because for a long period of time, many people felt like they had to silence themselves. They had to falsify their public preferences because it was too shameful to be out and about as a gay person, or frankly, even as an advocate for gay rights. It was too shameful to talk about sex openly. And Cass has actually said that one of the reasons he has not come out openly about his animal rights philosophy is because he feels a little ashamed. In fact, when he was getting appointed to be the head of OIRA under Obama, Fox News went after him hard for saying, you're gonna go after our mousetraps and take away our burgers. And we're seeing the same thing happen to Cory Booker right now. As a vegan who's a presidential candidate, you're seeing a lot of people make fun of him, say, what's he gonna do next? Take away our Chick-fil-A, our burgers, our barbecues. So I wonder if I can turn this point on its head, though. One of the points Cass makes about preference falsification is, while it is this incredible obstacle we have to try and overcome in order to achieve social change, it also suggests a certain fragility to the mainstream view. That if the only way this system can sustain itself is by silencing everyone, all the millions and millions of people around the world who really deeply care about this issue, this is why once that preference falsification paradigm switches and people realize, I can speak about this, I can say me too, I can say I'm out and proud, things can turn very quickly. I mean, what do you think about that? And do you think there's a way for us to overcome this problem, which I think is a broader problem than just you or the people in this room, of people out there thinking, I believe in animal rights, I believe in vegetarianism or veganism, but I can't be talking about this too openly.
So I think there are a couple things here. One is that, so I love Cass's work on this. I think it's really important, right? And to even draw it a little bit further, like one of the implications is that it may be that once movement happens, it moves really fast, right? That's his argument. That he wrote this great paper that's related to that book about the Me Too movement, and just making the point that people didn't feel able to talk about the amount of workplace sexual harassment they were experiencing. Once they could, the amount of it that was there created a movement like instantly. And so like that was the fact that something seems quiet now does not mean it will be quiet when it comes up. I think that is right. The question here for me, let me think about how to say this. I think of how fast a movement can happen, how fast behavioral change can happen, as sort of integrating two different questions. One is, how fast can you get people to believe and adopt the values? But then the other is, how much is it going to require them to change in their lives? And one thing that I think movements often do when they're being successful is are able to split those two questions. And I will say, I think one of the hardest things for the animal rights movement has been that it has overly combined those two questions. That a lot of people believe a set of things about animal rights and about animal suffering, but the set of behavioral changes is too big for them to make. And so then they believe they can't believe the other things, right? They're a bad vegetarian. It's actually a really interesting and unusual thing that it's been, most people, when they think about the identities at play here, think about identities that describe a diet more than identities that describe a value system. And I recognize that veganism is a value system, but people understand the word as a diet. And so something that I think is really important is recognizing that there's a first step, right? There's a first step you have to get people to, which is that animal suffering matters. Whatever you want to do with it, and maybe nothing, animal suffering matters. People who are progressive, people who believe in climate change, right? People identify even as climate activists are constantly making climate change worse. I'm doing it all the time. I take planes, right? I'm going to be on a plane to New York in a couple days. Now, I do a lot of work on climate change. Like, I try to make it better, but I kind of recognize that I live inside a system that is not built to reduce your carbon footprint easily. What I'm trying to do is create systemic change such that we can reduce people's carbon footprint easily. And so I think there's something about being able to separate the belief in the systemic set of values from the individual behavioral questions that would be important for having the kind of like fast tip you see there. But then the other thing you're talking about, so I think people are on the one hand held in place a bit by what will it require of them, right? If they don't feel that they can live that way, then the cognitive dissonance kicks back in. I sort of described a bit of that in my own story. But then the other thing that I think you get is sort of what you're talking about, which is like the immune system response, well, I don't want to be the person who is making people uncomfortable. And Senator Booker is a great example here. I give him all the credit in the world for being in national politics and running in presidential politics as a vegan. And I also think that he has approached that in a way that has not helped him. I think that he has been afraid of it himself. And so is really, really, really trying. On the one, he has this thing that is very distinguishing. The thing that is true about Senator Booker and that sets him apart from a lot of other politicians is the degree to which he lives his own values. He lives in a project. He is himself a vegan. He's somebody I've known as a reporter for a long time. And there is a unity between what he believes systematically and how he practices in his own life that is unusual among politicians, among people. But he does not, he's also a politician and he does not want to offend people. And so what he's done in a funny way is he's managed to have like the bad of having a label that people are not used to, but without actually making a rallying cry for his own candidacy. And I saw this in the CNN debate. Like, I sort of wish he'd said, not that I'm like taking away your burgers, but actually go on the offensive. And I think we're in an age where politicians and the political activists and the media figures and so on who tend to thrive, we're in an age of identity construction, right? That's what social media is. And so being the person who you're able to build identity around is powerful. It probably would not win him the presidency, but I don't think I also don't think he's going to win the presidency. So I think that he, like a lot of people in this space, I think it is important to be able to pull people with you, but not to be afraid. Right? And I think that, as you say, the thing that holds people back here is fear. And then it just turns out that there's just not that much to be afraid of. You know what happens when people like feel a little bit bad about the fact that you think it's bad that they're eating chickens? Like, they feel a little uncomfortable about it. That's what happens. It's okay. Like, it's okay for things to be a little bit awkward. And I think that if you're able to scale that up, I don't think that the social opprobrium system is a strong one. I think there'd be a long way between that falling and getting to the world a lot of us in this room would like to see. But I think the world where you feel too uncomfortable talking about this, that's a very weak barrier. Like, that could be broken pretty quickly.
Yeah, and if all of you haven't seen the piece, Vox did probably the best reporting on this, and I encourage everyone to read the article about Cory Booker's response to the question about veganism in the CNN presidential debates. Something you just mentioned about this divide between the behavioral question as to what we should do in response to animal suffering, and just acknowledging that animal suffering does matter, because I think this is a crucial one for the animal rights movement. And in particular, I'm going to ask you what you think about the dominant paradigm in the animal rights movement, which I would describe as consumer activism. That at the end of the day, for us to change the world for animals, what we have to do is change what people eat. Change consumers, one by one, go out there and convince them to become vegetarian and vegan. And in particular, I want to ask you if you think what I see as a shift happening in the environmental movement should be happening with the animal rights movement, which is to say, when you and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, you may remember this book, 50 Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth. Do you remember this book?
I don't, but I was a shitty kid.
Well, it was actually a New York Times bestseller in the 1980s, and there's all this discussion about how the environment's collapsing, climate change is becoming more a public issue starting in the 80s, and the thinking at the time was the way we reverse this is we take shorter showers, we eat a little less meat, we don't drive in cars or go on planes quite as much. And I think there's been a lot of research now and some investigative journalism finding that the industry actually liked this paradigm. They like the idea that the responsibility for all these environmental atrocities laid on the average consumer, that it's not our fault, we're just delivering what people want. People want to drive in planes, they want to buy plastic, they want to eat lots of meat. And now what I think we're seeing in the environmental movement, with especially Greta Thunberg, is the idea that no, this is not the responsibility of the everyday person who has very little power and responsibility over the climate catastrophe that our planet is facing. It's a responsibility of the people in power to make sure our systems are organized in a way that facilitates ordinary people to make choices in alignment with their own values. So I guess my question for you is, do you see the animal rights movement going in the same direction, and should we go in the same direction, and moving away from talking about and asking whether people are vegetarian or vegan, and discussing more our food policy, our agricultural policy, and frankly, even the idea that animals should have some representation in the legal system?
I wouldn't put those things in opposition, is the way I would put it. So for all the inspiration of Greta Thunberg, what she is an individual person who began recognizing something individually and has unified and organized and become an inspiration to a lot of other people like that. Systems of power will not change if people don't change. People will not change if systems of power don't change. It's a dynamic kind of equilibrium there. And that makes it really, really hard. Now that the idea that I do not feel myself expert enough on the animal rights movement to say what the movement is or should be doing. But what I see in every movement that I cover is movements are ecosystems. And they are constantly, endlessly, forever trapped by arguments between people in them who have different strategies, arguing about which strategy is better, and the answer is always both of them. The answer is always 100% of the time, you are going to need every single one of these strategies operating simultaneously if you're to have any hope of getting anywhere near the world you want to get to. So I will say, for all the inspiration of the climate movement, it's currently failing. Right? We are warming the world faster than ever right now, like today. So it's inspiring to see the movement coming up, right? And the power that is being generated by it. But we're not at a point, there's always this, I think, effort to kind of roll out like mission accomplished banners. And you're going to need everything there. People are going to need to feel bad individually. They're going to need to push systems of power. And technology is going to have to work. And that's a piece of this too. Like when I think of the animal rights movement, I actually think it has not just an obvious interaction with the climate movement because of the importance of animal agriculture in climate policy, but a symmetry with it in that what those two movements are going to need is, on the one hand, people want to make a change, and on the other hand, technology makes it easy for them to make the change. That if these things are going to work, it's not just, look, sometimes I listen to folks on the left on climate change talking about how we're going to need to go and like just accept that like we can't just have economies growing forever. And like that is like a reasonable point that is not going to work. Like it is not. If you're going to get people to accept no growth, you are going to only do that after such a series of calamities that we've already lost. So we are going to have to figure this out in a way that people can recognize that the way we are living right now is genuinely unjust. It is immoral. What we are visiting upon the people who will come after us is ungodly. And that we're going to have to approach this in a way where we're trying to make it possible for people to continue living their lives. Because if not, the psychological barrier to getting them to agree with the first thing is going to be too high. If they don't want to live in the world you are painting over here, they are not going to accept a set of values you're trying to convince them of over here. And similarly, I spent a lot of time talking in the animal rights movement to the clean meat people, Bruce Friedrich, and that world of folks. And a lot of these people have come out of more hardcore forms of animal activism. Bruce was the head of PETA, PETA's campaigns department rather. I was talking with Leah Garces recently, who's head of Mercies for Animals, but has done a bunch of other things too. And, they come out of having a deep sense in some ways of failure, of having worked at this for so long, and the number of animals being killed every year for meat is larger and larger and larger. But also what I see happening in these spaces is a kind of, to use the term of this weekend, I guess, convergence. That the kind of mass efforts at persuasion and mobilization and opinion change, and to the work DXE does, confrontation, is going to be really important at the same time that people are doing the work to say, and you know what? It wouldn't be that hard to believe in that. It won't take that much from you. It won't mean you can never eat something that tastes like a burger again. That's not the ask. And so tactical and strategic questions are really important, but I find that the conversations have this strange, one ring to rule them all quality, when the question is always, what is the mix? And how do you get the things to work in concert with one another?
So that's a great point. And I think it's a great segue into what I think is a subject that's on all of our minds, and we're actually having a workshop about this later today, which is, how do we integrate our movement into the climate movement? And I think all of us in this room probably know that factory farming is one of the greatest contributors to climate change. We know that non-human animals are probably the greatest victims of climate change by 3, 4, 6 orders of magnitude. And yet the conventional mainstream climate change conversation still very rarely addresses animals or factory farms at all. So I guess my question to you as a journalist who studied climate change and is now starting to write about animal rights, what do you see as the connections between the issue, and what do you see as the ways for us as activists, and frankly just ordinary people talking about the issue, to bring these two movements together? And then I think Cassie has something she wants to interject too.
Yeah, so people are asking what the most important thing individuals can do is, because I know you're talking about this as a system-wide problem, both climate change, animal rights. What can an individual do to affect political change is the question.
These are two different questions.
Why don't you take that one
right.
first, and then we'll talk about climate change next.
Great. So I have two answers to that. And one is the individual answer, and then one is the systems answer. One is the deep recognition that democracy and political change is an everyday practice. And so the thing that we were talking about earlier about whether or not you are quiet about your values when you're in contact with people who don't share them, the single biggest thing I think people can do in their day-to-day life is not be quiet about their values. You need to create, I will say that like some of my friends, I will say that in my community of people, around us, people are more vegetarian than they were before me and my wife and some of our other friends went in these directions. But obviously not everybody is by any means. But the difference is that I think we all think about it a little bit more, right? I'm not trying necessarily to convert. What I'm trying to do is raise, right? I'm just trying to have, I just want people to think of what they eat as a moral question. And if you can answer it, right? If you can answer it for yourself in a different way than I have, I think that's okay. I think the fundamental thing is seeing what you eat as a moral question and being alert to the suffering within it. And then people can go in different directions. I have actually respect. I mean, if you always run into people I hunt all my own food. It's okay, you're really not my problem. You and I may disagree on the margin somewhere, but I'm not worried about you out there with your bow and arrow. It's fine. You can do your thing. So I think that's one thing, is recognizing that every day we are engaged in small d democratic practice, and small d democratic practice requires this kind of, and I will just, I was not intending to plug podcasts, but I have on Monday a podcast with this woman, Danielle Allen, about democratic practice, just one of the best conversations I've ever had as a human being, and people should check it out. But it requires, her point is combining a recognition that you're trying to get people to change their behaviors in ways that might include loss, right? That may be hard for them, that may require them to say, I've been doing something wrong, or I'm going to lose something I like. It is hard if you've grown up eating animals, right? If that's been your culture, if that's what your family does, to then go out into the world and change all that. And so it requires also combining it with an ethic of political friendship. We're not enemies. I'm not mad at you. I've been here, right? 6 years ago, I ate meat. So there's that. But the other thing is, and this maybe actually connects to the climate change question, and something I believe very strongly, is you need to connect into actual politics. And particularly when actual politics has not been friendly to the things you care about, particularly when you feel that sense of alienation. We were just talking about an article earlier about how animal rights is the orphan stepchild of the left. I think it is really important, and I think we are in a moment when you are beginning to see mainstream politicians, in this case specifically in the Democratic Party, though in the UK it's happening in the Labour Party, and in other places you have other dimensions of it, begin to make the first steps towards the idea that maybe if you believe all the things that progressives believe, you should also believe that we should curb animal suffering, right? We talked about Cory Booker. Julian Castro brought out a pretty impressive, I thought, not that it went as far as I would, but for somebody who does not have a profile on this issue to bring out an animal rights agenda, that was big. That was an actual important moment. His in many ways was actually, to my surprise, a little bit more ambitious than what Booker had. So I believe Tulsi Gabbard is vegan, if I'm not wrong. And so all of a sudden you can really see that there's an opening here. And so trying to think about how in 2024 or 2028 or 2032, it's just normal that everybody running for president as a Democrat has an animal rights agenda, that's huge. Because then it's not just the power of the people who are on this issue, but it's the power of everybody in coalition with the progressive movement. And that's how other movements work, right? It is not that everybody, the important thing, for instance, that the climate change folks are doing is connecting into everything else, right? That now it is just Green New Deal is not a policy, it's an ideology. Green New Deal is saying that, like, to be a Democrat, this is what it means. To be a progressive, this is what it means. And it means that you're connecting these overriding questions of climate with questions of human dignity and suffering and so on. There is no reason that animal suffering should not be in there. I've watched Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in an Instagram, I don't understand some of these platforms now, an Instagram story, sorry, thank you. Talk about how her heart wants to be vegetarian, but she often eats animals. And that's an ally. Like, that is this close. And so looking for how you build into that movement, into a movement that already exists and already holds roughly, but not exactly, a little bit less than half of the levers of power in this country. Like, that is a huge kind of politics. And in order to do that with mayors, there are a lot of city issues that are actually about animal suffering, including kill shelters and other things. To do that with legislators in your state, in your Senate, to do that with members of Congress, to do that with the politicians who are closest to you, you can have a lot of power here. The presidential level is actually moving pretty fast on this, but people then index way too much on presidential politics. Try to move the local politicians near you. When I talked to Julian Castro about why he ended up bringing out an animal rights agenda, it is because of work he did as San Antonio mayor. It is because of things that activists in San Antonio made him aware of that then made him aware of this issue, and it has sat in the back of his head for years and years and years. And when he was HUD secretary, he did not talk about it, but then he ran for president and he told his policy team, this may sound weird to you, but I want an animal rights agenda. And so that work you do at the local level, it pays off later. So that is the other thing.
Like, one of the things he said in the podcast that was stunning even to me was he said, of all the issues I cover and I deal with, animal cruelty issues are actually maybe the issue I get more public response to than anything else.
It's the weirdest thing about this issue.
It is a strange thing because it's so politically absent from the conversation, and yet you do see, I read somewhere on social media, apparently animal videos are the most shared thing on social media, that people love going to the dodo and sharing some cute animal rescue.
Apparently? Have you ever been on the internet? It's just animal videos and porn.
Animal videos. Animal viz and porn. We heard it from Ezra Klein, the master of the internet. This is a great segue into the conversation about climate change. Why is it then, if so many people care so deeply about this issue, they're so salient to us on a personal level, we can't make these political issues. We can't get that on, maybe it's exactly what you said. We're just not starting from the ground up with our local politicians. I don't know. What do you think?
This is the weirdest thing about that. I think about this all the time. People don't like people. They only like animals. Like,
that wasn't me saying that. That was Ezra Klein, for the record, all right?
Like,
I'm not the human hater.
Watch any movie. Every year, I'm forced by other members of my household to watch Independence Day on Independence Day.
Sorry, I'm really sorry.
I'd say it's an okay movie, but it is loved by people who I love. And if you watch that movie, like, the plot of that movie, if you just kind of take a step back, is like the aliens come and they blow up all the cities, but, like, thank God the dog didn't die. Right? Like, that's the emotional core of that film. Like, that the dog doesn't die. Like it is in every film. Like, if you want to make people upset, there was a couple of years ago, this is my favorite. There was a movie, it was with Idris Elba and Kate Winslet, I think. Am I right? Kate Winslet was in Titanic, right? Yes, okay. And the movie was like Idris Elba, Kate Winslet, and a dog crash land in the mountains and have to, like, survive to get out. And the publicity of the movie wasn't going well until they realized two things. One, they had to make it more clear that, like, this was a fantasy about being trapped in a mountain with Idris Elba. But two, they had to make it clear in the materials that the dog was going to survive. That if people thought they were going to go to this movie and the dog was going to die, nobody was going to go. And so there are so many issues that I work on where what you have to do is convince people of something they don't believe. Convince people of something they don't care about, right? Foreign aid often works this way. Everything. Like, I feel extremely strongly about local zoning policy, but really try to convince people they care about zoning. Like, it's hard. They care about their house. Animals? You have to convince people of nothing except to believe what they already believe, right? they like animals, they love animals, they have pets, they believe that animals can suffer. They would agree that it is a sign of sociopathic tendencies if you kick a puppy, or like if you tip cows or whatever. And it is just like this. I mean, this is where I get into like green pill analogies and like it is just like this kind of like blanket has been like thrown over people's moral intuitions here. The amount of work being done in quiet social ways to just get people to not see what kids see immediately, to talk kids out of like the thing that is just, I have a young son now, and so I have a lot of children's books. The thing about children's books is they're no people. They're all animals. All children's books are about animals. It's like the hippos and the belly button. Like, it's weird. And yet, so the amount of work being done to get us to not deal with this, and by the way, it's not for no reason. Like, human beings, it used to be that there are not enough calories to survive as a human being. And so you get, like, I mean, nature, it's not like animals are nice to animals. Like, nature's a fucked up place. But we don't live in nature anymore. Haven't for a long time. Like, we live in the Anthropocene. For worse, and sometimes it can be for better. And so, yeah, like, this is not a place where people aren't there. The problem is not that you're telling people to care about something they don't care about. The problem is that you're facing people with a cognitive dissonance between what they care about and how they live. That is unbelievably painful. And by the way, it's not just painful for this issue, it's painful for issues like climate. But even here, right, I was like very careful to say, I have been near cheese. Like, just so y'all, like it has happened. I try not to be, but the cognitive dissonance.
You feel bad about that?
No, I don't, but I always want to be careful that I'm not overrunning people's more, like, I don't want to take labels that are not mine. Something I actually feel exceptionally strongly about is that it is really important to let people be 60%, 70%, 80%, 90% good on these things. That purity politics is deadly in everything. And that when you create, like, there are like, the reason I think about this is like there are exceptionally long Reddit threads about, is Ezra a vegan? Because, and I actually don't do this anymore, but in one of my earliest podcasts about this, I talked about how I'm vegan except for I had a tradition with my best friend's family of eating sushi like a couple times a year. And so at that time I was like vegan except I still did that like twice a year. All these people are like he may be an ally, but he's not a vegan. And it's like, okay, fine. But the thing that happens if you don't let people, it's a big choice jump to make. And if failing or not doing it for a minute means you're out, then the thing is people switch all the way back. And by the way, that happened to me a bunch of times. I would be vegetarian and then I would go travel. And when I was traveling, I would be tired. I would not be around the food I knew. Like, other people would be controlling my meals. And then I would fail. And then having failed, I would go all the way back. And so the actual thing that allowed me to make the behavioral change that stuck was for a while, I was vegetarian except when I traveled. And then, of course, as I got better at it, because you actually get better at it, right? It is like when you're starting this, and it is hard to remember, but when you're starting into a new way of eating and being in the world, you're actually just not that good at it. And so then as I got better at it, then of course I just stopped eating meat when I traveled. But like for a little while, then I would still like let myself have a burger once in a while. And then I just stopped doing that. And like every time, like the thing that I was doing that was like and so now the thing I say about cheese is when I travel or I'm going to somebody's house for dinner, like, and there's some dairy, like, you know, I can get into this, but I just don't treat it as a huge thing. And that creates a kind of soft enough boundary that I don't feel like I'm constantly like failing or almost failing or something, and it works for me. It's how I'm able to hold there. The world is not set up to be vegan, right? And so whatever you want to call people, I think it's very important. Like the thing that I care about with people, the conversion I am trying to make is, are you someone who every day you think about animal suffering? And every day we cause suffering. Like, and by the way, like even if you're eating vegan, right? I mean, you guys probably all like the incredibly annoying, like, what about the field mice, right thing? It's not that there's nothing to what about the field mice, right? Not that there's nothing to what is being taken up to grow soybeans. It's just that it's a bullshit argument that people are not making out of like an authentic concern for animal ethics. I would love to be in the place where we began worrying about the field mice. Like, great, I'd love to have that'd be great. But I think the thing like that I want to get people to in my own world is just thinking about it. And then like we do, people who care about poverty do not donate all their money, right? They often end up buying shirts that they don't know what the sourcing is. People who care about climate take plane flights. What you want to do is you want to get people to the values so they can, so that now that they're there individually, and this actually goes to your question really well, once you get them there on the individual values and on the identity, then they begin pushing the political system to make it easier to live out their values and identity in a clean way. And that to me is that is the transmission mechanism. But you can't kick people out of the identity first before they're there as your ally making political change.
I think I agree with you 100%, and it's one of the reasons we started DXC. We don't even use the V word that much because we want to be inclusive of folks who are not yet vegetarian or vegan. But I think the delicate balance that a lot of folks in this room are probably struggling with is, on the one hand, we don't want to be silent, right? We don't want to be the person who silences our values, and you just encourage us, don't be the person who silences themselves. On the other hand, we want to include folks and not make them feel like they're being excluded when we speak out about an issue that we deeply care about, and that many people in this room have cried, spent many nights just watching videos and thinking about all the horrible things that are happening to animals. So how do you cut that balance in your personal life, and how do you suggest other people cut that balance?
So two things. So I do, first, let me recognize that that's really hard. And everybody I talk to in this space, and it's just like an experience here I want to validate, and an experience that I have is like that feeling of being around people you love while they're doing something that at a certain point begins to feel like an affront to you, right? Like if I can't convince you of this and and like you don't even disagree, like then what? Like what does it mean about it? So I just want to note that like the emotional tenor of that. It's a real thing. I would say two things. One is that it's just a pretty distinct thing in my political experience to the animal rights question that there is such a emphasis, or has been, I think a lot of people have moved away from it, but such an emphasis on behavioral purity. That experience of looking out at a world that you see as unjust is common. It is common, right? I work on healthcare issues. I work on poverty issues and economic issues, climate issues and environmental issues, foreign aid issues. I just did an interview with Sam Power about genocide, right? There's a lot of injustice in the world, and it just is not usually the case that in order to speak about your value, it is demanded of you that you are living it 100% of the time. And it is actually often unclear to me whether or not this is coming from like vegans and vegetarians, or it's actually being imposed on them as part of the way of keeping them shut up, right? That there is a tendency to be like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but like the Cory Booker one of like, are you going to take away everybody's burgers is like one version of it, right? Which is like not usually what you get asked on other issues. I mean, I guess a little bit can be on climate because climate also has some level of purity politics associated with it. But when people talk about like taxing in order to like help with poverty, it's not like, well, you're going to tax all of everybody's money until everybody, no, that is the answer. But so then the other is that I find in my own practice of this as a political act that it is important for me to front load that, one, I do not have any perfection on this or claim to perfection on this. Two, that this is new for me. I try to talk all the time about the fact that 5 or 6 years ago or whatever it is, I don't exactly remember, I believed everything I believe now, and I ate animals. That was true for me 6 years ago. And it was not that I needed some moral recognition or that a paper had not come out or something. And that for me is a constant lesson and is something I think about a lot in my own soul of how easy it is to put suffering out of your mind. How easy it is to just know things are bad and decide I'm just not going to worry about it because it's more convenient for me. And so I have absolutely no moral license here. And there are other things that I do this with, I am sure, right? To some degree, probably climate, which I do think about, but I don't think I've made as radical life changes as I have around animal rights. I identify as an effective altruist, but how much you should give away, I definitely live a comfortable life. And within a lot of the effective altruism constructions, that might, I recently bought a game for my Nintendo Switch.
You're
And
a
that
terrible
is
person.
10 malaria bed nets that I did not, you know what I mean? But like, that's a real moral calculus. And so I think it's important to inhabit like the fact that living life can cause us some suffering. And I don't know, I try to just be I try to really celebrate people making small steps, not big ones. And I try to be very clear that my steps have been small steps, not big ones. And that if everybody just cared a bit, like the world would be a lot better, right? But I want everybody to care a bit more than I want 2% of people to care 100%.
Yeah, just two quick observations about that. Doug McAdam, a sociologist at Stanford, who's probably done the best work on what brings people to social movements, pointed out to us when we first talked to him a couple years ago that purity politics is the #1 problem in every social movement he studied. So it's not just animal rights and climate change, it's in every movement. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, all these movements. And the second thing I want to say is, you know, our approach here at DXE is what we call the open model, where we integrate people and we have our values very strongly. We state, this is the way we want to take the world. We want you to be a part of it. But what we find is that if we don't exclude people and shame them and attack them on a personal level for where they are, they start moving that direction. And frankly, there's some very influential people we've worked with where this story is unfolded in exactly that way. Katie Tang, who passed the fur ban with us, wasn't even a vegetarian when we first started working with her. And a lot of people said, why are you even working with this non-vegetarian? And she passed a historic ban on fur in San Francisco that's now led to a ban on fur probably in the state of California within a few days. Glenn Greenwald wasn't a vegetarian when we first started talking to him. Now he's talking about veganism all the time on Twitter, on Facebook, and going after people for not being vegan enough, right? So this journey is actually a journey many people go on, and we have to be inclusive of people who are on that journey as long as they're moving in the right direction. So I think it's really important. And I think Cassie has something
I want to
from the
say
audience,
one
but
thing on
please,
this
go
real
ahead.
quick, because it's something that's important in the work you guys do at DXC. And in some ways, I'm probably even being part of the problem because we're talking a lot here about what you eat. But the fundamental thing that almost everybody agrees on is confined animal feeding operations are cruel and wrong. Like, the wedge in this is not whether or not you will eat animals, it is whether or not animals should be tortured for their entire lives before they are killed. And the more the focus can, at least for now, the more that what people were forced to think about was that suffering, that locus of suffering, not whether or not, like, they believe human beings evolved to eat animals, because, like, look at our teeth, like, but actually, do they think we should have confined animal feeding operations? And, like, are they willing to look at that and say that, like, yes, I am willing to sign on and be part of that? People are not. And so I do think that's another powerful piece of this, is just, there's a place where there's a lot of agreement here. And then what is done, and this happens to a lot of movements, is people instead focus everybody on where there's disagreement. And if you can hold to where people actually agree, which has been very successful in a lot of these ballot initiatives and so on that have been, I mean, California passed a great one in 2016, right? Maybe it's 2018. 2018. They don't go far enough, but by focusing there, they get overwhelming support. And that's how you change systems.
Well, that's super related to the questions you have coming in about legislative change, which is, what do you think is the right ask to focus on legislatively? Is it banning things like animal testing, entertainment, meat? Is it the right to rescue, or is there something else that you see being the right legislative focus?
I don't know about legislative focus exactly. People here know a lot more about these issues than I do. I also don't think you need to choose in general. You can imagine animal welfare bills. It would include a lot of these different things. What I will say it strongly and like till I'm blue in the face, is state legislatures. State legislatures. State legislatures. National politics is highly polarized, highly gridlocked, divided government. Nothing is going anywhere. National politics has a filibuster, which most state legislatures don't have, which is another issue. You are not strong nationally. Most people are not. On state levels, your state senator never hears from anybody. Most people in your state senator's district do not know his or her name. They would love some attention and also be afraid of some counter-organizing. And so focusing on the state legislature level is, number one, much more effective. It's much more inspiring because you actually get to do local coalition building and meet people and actually be involved in local politics. And it is the state bills that will lead up and ladder up to anything that ever happens nationally. So pick your ask, do what you want to do, but focus on your city council and focus on your state legislature. There's stuff you can do locally, like kill shelters and other things. Then there's an enormous amount you can do in states. And by the way, states also have another issue, which is if you can't sell, for instance, this has been going on in cars for a long time. California just constantly passes these very high CAFE standards, these very high fuel standards. And I know there's been some legal issues around this in the last year or two, but way ahead of where the rest of the country has been. And so then, it's a big market. Automakers want to sell into it. So they've just basically been selling the cars the California demands to the country. So if you're able to do this in enough places, that becomes what is sold everywhere because they're just big markets and in integrated operations. In order to serve the big markets, you can't have half the market serving the big markets and half the market serving you have to do it. So there's a lot of power in changing things at the state and local level.
Do you have any thoughts on the trade-off between focusing on your local city council versus a state legislature? Just out of curiosity.
I don't. I don't think you should have to choose. I don't like it. I just don't think that's a choice one has to make. You're dealing with very integrated political operations at that point. If you're dealing with things inside your city council members and mayor and state rep, they know each other. They attend the same things. They are dealing with many of the same bases of support and interest groups and so on. They're different. I don't want to tell you they're not, but I just wouldn't think of that as a choice. And, but in general, there are powers that states have that cities don't. And so if you're dealing with things like how are animals treated, you're probably going to be dealing with state legislatures more than you're dealing with cities.
Ezra's advice has definitely been consistent with our experience, where for years we were trying to get even vegan legislators at the federal level to pay attention to the issue. Things like right to know, right to rescue, and got nowhere with it. And I think within the first few weeks of people like Leslie reaching out to our local city council candidates about right to know and animal rights, it was literally on the next debate, right? The big debate they had locally, people were spending 15, 20 minutes talking about animal agriculture and factory farming. So I think your advice is very sound. Are you getting any other comments or questions? We're getting near the end, so I want to make sure we're getting some audience feedback. Anything else you're saying? Well, let's go to the climate change question then, because we kind of put that aside for a moment. But how do you think the animal rights movement can integrate or should integrate in the climate change movement?
So I've been writing about this for a long time. I had a Washington Post column on food for about a year, and I wrote a bunch about climate change and animal agriculture. And the thing I've tried to beat the drum on this is not just one of the best changes you can make, but weirdly the easiest. And this is another one of those drives me crazy things. For some reason, it has become incredibly socially acceptable to shame people who live in rural areas or have old cars for what they drive, which is a change they probably cannot afford to make in many cases. But it is totally not unacceptable, but it is has a lot more social friction to be eat spaghetti with tomato sauce 3 nights a week. Or some kind of vegetarian. It's easy, right? People already do that. Have peanut butter and jelly instead of peanut butter and deli meat, right? In your kid's lunch. There's a million things you could do there that are really easy. It is just not, people eat vegetarian all the time. They eat low carbon meals all the time with no problem, right? Falafel is delicious. And so this is one of those things where I find that the discourse, and understandably so, is very scoldy. It's animal agriculture is one of the single largest and so, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity for it to be a little bit more inspiring. You want to do one thing, do this one thing. Just 4 nights a week or 4 days a week, don't eat meat. And don't eat it because of climate. And you don't have to go all the way, just 4 days a week. And there's all kinds of there are all kinds of studies showing that if you get the average American to change away from beef and pig meat, even just 1 or 2 days a week, it means more than them buying all their food from within a 100-mile radius, right? It actually is a very big effect. And then also to the other question of the movement, if people are used to doing that 4 days, well, all of a sudden they kind of know how to do it. And then it's not that big of a jump to be maybe 6 days, and then maybe 7. Except on holidays. And then maybe there are no more holidays. And then. And so, one, I see that as a very thin edge of the wedge. And then 2, that broader question, which is not, can you kind of serve up the things you care about as an answer in the climate movement? but can you get the climate movement to care about the things you care about, to care about the suffering you care about? That is another big, important thing that I think is entirely about coalition building, right? And being involved in their groups and studies and so on, and then being there and having a seat at the table so that you're able to raise your own issues. And like, that's just classic coalitional politics. And it requires, I think, being open-hearted and being able to meet people where they are and all the things you've been talking about and all things so many of you do all the time. But it, more than anything, requires being there with them. And so if you're dealing with a bigger movement that you want to see your issues, given how important what y'all are doing for what they need, it makes sense for animal rights folks to be there, but then it also makes sense for animal rights people to be talking about the right side of it, not just the real dangerous thing to me here. And I do want to note this because it comes up all the time in when I talk to people, is a totally disastrous outcome is that people move off of beef to chicken, right? And that's what a lot of people do when they hear about the climate issue. And they move from beef to chicken. And so that is, I mean, you guys all know this, but like a family of 4 can maybe eat 1 cow a year, but they can eat 2 chickens a night. And chickens are treated the worst. And so it's really, really, really important to not let that happen. And that does require that kind of coalitional, like, hey, listen, this is not better. Like, you got it. We're not trying to create more suffering here. We're trying to create less. So like, move to spaghetti. Like wheat doesn't feel anything.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing is the vegan diet is even better than the chicken-based diet, but you're absolutely right that it's an order of magnitude difference between chicken and beef. And that's been, a concern of a lot of us in framing our movement too much around climate change. But I think we have another question from the audience, maybe.
Yeah, so earlier, Ezra, you said that you think we should be making people uncomfortable, but you think that is a good thing for vegans to do. And people want you to expand on how you think we should do that. And maybe particularly in DXC, where we have an abolitionist message, but we also do want to practice inclusivity and keep all these things in mind.
Yeah, and I want to be careful what I'm saying here. And those of you who kind of follow my work, I'm not Glenn. I have a more conciliatory personal style. I think as he'd be the first to say. And when I say make people uncomfortable, I don't mean like shout at them across a dinner table. What I mean is just being honest about your own values in a way that is like truthful and humble. I don't mean indicting them or condemning them or saying they're bad people or getting into like a tit for tat about who lives a morally pure life. But there's a huge difference. There's a big difference between silence and honesty, and there's a big difference between honesty and confrontation. And the place that I try to live in this is honesty, right? When people say to me, and it's always one of these weird things. People are always like, oh, the thing about vegans is they're always talking about veganism. And in my experience, you're always getting asked about it. People are always like, well, why aren't you eating? And it's like, then you explain like, oh, vegans always talk about, like, you asked. But people ask. And when they ask, I tell them. I don't turn to them if they're eating and start shouting. But yeah, like they ask. If they've had a couple meals with you and you don't eat the meat, they will almost always ask the question, why? And the thing that's really important to me in answering that is animal suffering. I don't do this for health, and honestly, I don't do it for climate. I do it because it's like not my right to torture sentient beings for my food. And so I can say that, and like I'm not saying anything about them. It's up to them, like what they want to do with it. And so like that's kind of where I come down on it. It can be uncomfortable, but I'm not making it uncomfortable. I am just being honest about like the way I try to live and like what I try to think is right in the world. And by the way, like I invite that from other people to me in my life, so I don't feel like it's something that I am doing to people or unto people. I appreciate it if, folks are truthful with me about how they're trying to live and like how they're trying to structure their lives. And so that, yeah, uncomfortable might be a tricky word because a lot of these conversations, they're not uncomfortable. Oftentimes they're uncomfortable for you, certainly if you're not used to them. They're uncomfortable for you because people can sometimes have a bad reaction. But that bad reaction is theirs. If you're being, again, I think, honest and like value-driven and open, right, inclusive, like it's not that I'm perfect, it's just that I tried to do this, and here's why. That's good. And then then they hold it with them and they figure it out over time.
Great. And if you do have time, maybe you can discuss that in relation to actions too, because obviously targeting the system, we want to bring that discomfort to the surface, but in a very different kind of way.
Yeah, and I just want to point one thing out as someone who had gotten into huge fights with my parents. My dad was a vivisector, and they tried to sneak meat into my food when I went vegan 20 or so years ago.
And if he's a vivisector, he can do it when it's so thin you can barely see it.
Yeah. So that what I found is that honesty is honestly the more caring route. That a lot of times when we act with aggression towards our family members or friends or people we're doing outreach on the street with, it's because there's some disconnect in our communication. It's because we cannot actually be candid with each other. And so, and all of us want our family members and friends to be honest with us. And if we're honest with them, it actually facilitates a strengthening of that relationship rather than hiding something and kind of having something come out sideways when you don't want it to come out because you're constantly silencing yourself. So I think Ezra's right. There is a way to have these uncomfortable, honest conversations in a way that shows we actually care about the people around us instead of condemning them and attacking them as individuals.
I would just add one thing on what you all do that I think is really inspiring, but I think is worth calling out in this, because I think it's an important answer to this question. As I have followed DXC's work, the thing that you do is you put it very much on yourselves. Like the message of DXC sort of forces people like me to grapple with, is people saying in a very real way, I refuse to live as if this system is okay, and I'm willing to bear tremendous personal cost and consequence for that. And that's, I think, often the power of nonviolent approaches to resistance, that it is showing the depth of your commitment to something such that I have to question how I'm living. And that's very different than screaming at me about how I'm living. And is more, I think, probably in most cases more effective, right? Saying, like, the fact that you all do what you do, it forces me to reflect. Whereas if you just came to me and yelled at me about what I do, it forces me to get defensive. And, you hear it all the time in relationships, but it's, I think, a very powerful form in activism. The word I is very powerful. And something that I try to do in my work is oftentimes on my podcast, for instance, if I'm making what is to me a criticism of the way the world works is going to make people defensive, I make it of myself. It is about what I am doing wrong or what I have done wrong and how I'm trying to grapple with that more than about what they're all doing wrong. Because that's an invitation to be in the conversation with me or to approach this question with me, like recognizing that we are all fallible, not an invitation to get defensive and tell me what I'm also doing wrong. And hey, do I, maybe I didn't eat that, but didn't I come here in a car? And you don't want to start that. It doesn't help. It can, and there are times for that kind of confrontation, but to me, a lot of the power of the kind of nonviolent work you all do and the cost you're all willing to bear is that it is an invitation and in some ways a demand for the rest of us to reflect. But because it isn't an attack, because it's not about what cost I need to bear, it doesn't activate my defenses.
Yeah, there's a concept in sociology called communicative suffering that has been used by many different movements, whether they knew that term or not. And this is relating to something the attorneys were saying yesterday, that one of the powerful things about our efforts to modify the legal system is we're not going out there saying to the slaughterhouse workers, even the politicians, hey, you have to bear all the consequences of this. We're bearing the consequences of this by, in some cases, subjecting ourselves to the legal process in ways that could separate us from our families for potentially decades. And I guess that's certainly a question that Cass was trying to invite us to entertain, which is, in a system like this, and we were talking about the green pill and how we live in a world where once you start opening yourself to the suffering, you start seeing it everywhere, and it becomes outrageous, it becomes hurtful, it becomes sad, it becomes traumatic for even us as activists and individuals. When are the times when we have to take a more confrontational approach? And I know you had a conversation with this with Adam Gopnik about this in a discussion about liberalism, and I know your temperament, your disposition is to take the more reformist, persuasive approach. Are there times where we just have to confront? And what are those times?
Yeah, I think there are, and two, I don't know. And this is something I was saying about with ecosystems earlier. Something that is true for movements, true for politics, true for the world, is there are different kinds of people in it. And there are people who are just much more confrontational in their approach to all kinds of politics. Like, I use Glenn and I as an example here, and I've known Glenn a long time and like him a lot personally, and I know he's got his criticisms of me, but Glenn and I think, just have a kind of different temperament in politics, which ends up informing both different strengths and weaknesses for us. And the thing that is incredibly clear is that you really need people like Glenn, because somebody who, like, I worry a lot about how the other people in my conversation are feeling and if they're being offended by me and so on. And that can be, and that's not saying he doesn't, but it's to say that I'm often not that good in a lonely cause, because I can be very good being persuasive if people are already like 50% of the way there. But like standing against when I like really have to be confrontational, that's very tough for me. And I would say that, you know, there have been places where you really need personalities that are willing to say like, no, you're all wrong, and nobody's standing up and saying it. And like are willing to do that is an incredibly powerful part of an ecosystem. And so I don't think of myself as a great expert on confrontational activism. I think a lot about, I do think specifically in the animal rights and a little bit in the climate space, what level of being engaged with the system is moral. It is a place, if there is any place that I know of, where much more confrontational activism seems to me to be relevant. I am somebody who thinks PETA has done a good job. I think that they've pissed a lot of people off, and it is important to have players like that who are willing to be the villains. Because what they do is they just keep a background hum of at least people are occasionally hearing that people hold these opinions. And that can be powerful if you're in a place where very few people do. So I think you need confrontational activism. I think you need confrontational activists. I think the scale of the horrors here do merit things that are beyond just having political conversations. It is not, there are people who know a lot about that form of activism, but I don't feel myself that like I know exactly what is the moment when you kind of metaphorically step outside the political system to act beyond it. But I think it is something that we don't talk about, honestly, enough. I think that, again, one way that systems keep themselves in power, again, a little bit like the don't make me uncomfortable police, is they raise the bar somehow so high for like exit, right? They make it seem so impossible to imagine that if everything is going against you in a way you think is immoral, that you would simply stand against the system itself, that people just stop imagining that it's something they can do. But it is something they can do, and that they have done, and that people like you in certain ways are doing, and it's important. And so the question of literally like, what is the exact issue? I don't know. Like, what is the exact circumstance? I don't know. But the question of whether it is needed, or like whether everybody should be like a milquetoast persuader, like running a podcast. No, like hopefully some people should be milquetoast persuaders running podcasts, but not everybody.
I saw you against Sam Harris. You can be pretty tough sometimes too. But you should give yourself a little bit credit. I think you're a little more than a milquetoast persuader. But there's actually another concept in social psychology called social desirability bias, which you've probably heard about. And this is, in many ways, I like to think about DXC as a network that was engineered to overcome social desirability bias, which is the idea that human beings generally, in any social environment, they will say exactly what the people around them want them to say. They will not say what's truthful. They'll not say what they should say. They'll say what people expect them to say. And if we can't overcome that, we can't overcome the problem Cass points out in his book, that we all sort of just falsify our preferences. And maybe everyone in the room actually agrees we need to change the system, but no one's willing to be the first person to say, hey, folks, let's just talk about the real issue here.
Yeah, and I mean, another, I think, idea in there that is just useful here is just the Overton window. You really need people who are, for those who don't know the idea, it's just like the Overton window is the range of acceptable opinion, the range of opinion people can even imagine. And you need people wrenching that outward, wrenching that to the side. I mean, 10 years ago in politics, the term socialist was considered an absolute like lethal term, right? No national politician would ever get near socialist. And Bernie Sanders, you know, in a steady way, and then obviously exploding out in the 2016 election, has transformed that. And now there is a vital identification with at least some forms of certainly democratic socialism. And you just see how quickly that has moved out. It's not achieved its goals yet, but it has changed the conversation in a profound way. And here too, I think that you need people pulling it out. You're right, I'm being like a little self-deprecating when I call it milquetoast persuader. Like, what I am trying to do is create in my particular space a belief, a feeling, like a model of experience that if you believe the set of things that I believe about the world, you should also believe this. That it's not weird, it would be weird to do the opposite. It would be weird to not see it. But you also need people who are, I think, out there going like much further. And I don't even have the most radical views one can have on this, right? Like I have, I think, in some ways, views almost everybody has on this. I just am a little bit more like, I've just kind of stepped through the looking glass and being like, okay, I'm going to go where they tell me to go. And I didn't always, right? I always say that, like I didn't always, but I don't think my views on this are even particularly radical. I think like most 5-year-olds hold them. People go a lot further, right? Like, so the people who are out there saying we should have legal personhood for animals. Well, I don't think everybody's going to go on that right now. I think that is a great place to be trying to pull the window. What is the compromise position between here and we should have legal personhood for animals? That creates space for that. And then maybe one day we have some kind of personhood. And so that work is just incredibly important of expanding the range of not just what people can imagine, but then because of what they can imagine, what feels reasonable. Because people anchor between the boundaries of what they have been taught are like acceptable opinion. And as new opinions become acceptable to them, then those boundaries change. And even what it means to become a milquetoast persuader can change.
So we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to end with, I think, maybe the most important question in this conversation, for me at least, which is, where do you see the world and politics changing in terms of animal rights in the next 50 years?
It depends on what you all do. It depends on what we all do. I mean, it depends to me on social movements. It depends on, does clean meat and lab-grown meat and like those other things that can act as bridges, do they become widespread and cheaper? Are we able to make the technological advances people? I mean, a world where having meat that did not come from an animal is cheaper, healthier, safer, more environmentally friendly, and more delicious than meat that did come from one, that's a different world. Like that is a very different world, and that makes a much easier path for activism. And I think this is a very interesting question of, do animal rights agendas become part of the mainstream, at least like liberal governance agendas? There is the Labor, I believe it's the Labor Party in Britain, came out with a pretty expansive animal rights agenda recently. You've begun, again, as we've talked about, to see it in this democratic election, but you didn't see it. I mean, Barack Obama didn't have one. You didn't see it before. So that'd be another thing. If it mainstreams into politics in the sense of like being a liberal just means caring about animal suffering in the way it also means caring about the suffering of the poor and caring about the environment. And just like, if that just becomes adopted into the macro political identity and there's strong movement and there's technology that's made this much easier for people to accept these premises and then decide to live by them, that's a really different world. I mean, one of the things that I believe is that we live in a punctuated period of animal cruelty. We live in the era between when we developed the technology to do animal cruelty on industrial scale, right? We couldn't do the kinds of things we did today 100 years ago because we didn't have antibiotics and refrigeration. Like if you put that many chickens in a room, they would give each other disease and die. We couldn't, so like this ability to do industrial scale animal cruelty, it's like 50, 60 years old. And hopefully we're just like 10 or 20 years out from the technologies that will eradicate it. And so I like to think of this as in some ways a particularly bad moment in the human history of this, but not one that is just gonna like we can change it, right? If people want it to change, the technology is clearly there to change it. Like if those things come together, it can be very different in 50 years.
I think those are good words to end with. Can we give a big round of applause to Ezra Klein for being here with us today? And let's make sure we take those words to heart, that if we want this change, it's going to be up to us to make it happen, all right? Thank you very much, Ezra.
Thank you
all for being here, and I think I'm going to pass the mic now to Tanya.